Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to understand what's at the core root of the crisis of our civilization, because we are now witnessing and living through an epic moral breakdown of biblical proportions. And unless we begin to understand this, many of the problems and the challenges we face as a people, as a country, as a culture, and as a civilization, this is not going to work in the end, right? We've been heading in one trajectory now, really, for the last couple hundred years. And we have to understand what's been at the core root of this civilizational crisis. The first of which, and this is where our classical liberal friends really need to think about this hard, rather than just have a knee-jerk reaction and go into defense mode, but the founding fathers of America, who were Enlightenment thinkers, who went along with secular principles of liberty and rejecting Holy Mother Church and ultimately the Gospels and Christ the King himself, set up an atheistic form of government, a secular form of government. That's a problem. And that's where lots of the origins of our problems today stem from. I said it before and I said it again. If you don't believe God is real, if you don't act like God is real, then guess what? Your citizens aren't going to believe in God, period. They're not. And we live in a society where people no longer respect a higher authority or those traditions that were passed on to us, traditions that were supposed to safeguard sort of our cultural elements of society. And that is all broken down now in favor of our fallen human nature and the drive for our disordered passions. You have to understand all this great disorder at the cultural level starts really at the familial level. Once the family is destroyed, it spreads out to the greater cultural level and eventually gets to the political system. That's why we can't vote ourselves out of this problem, because the politicians at the top of the food chain are simply giving us the very disorders we all want. That's the whole idea behind democracy, right? We determine our moral principles by a show of hands, and this is what we've done. They fed us these things through democracy. And until we understand there's no fixing the democratic process, until we fix all these disorders, democracy is worthless to us. Now, I'm not even sure democracy can work in a well-ordered society. I think it can work limitedly in a homogeneous society. I believe that's how the ancient Greek philosophers referred to democracy, or how they stated that was the best method where democracy could work in a limited aspect, was in homogeneous cultures. But America's not homogeneous. There's no way it's ever going to work. Again, me as a Sicilian, coming from a very mixed breed line of peoples, a part of the world where that island was conquered by various, again, different tribes and groups over the centuries, we know as Sicilians what it takes to consolidate and make our culture function in somewhat of a homogeneous method. And that was the church. The church put it all together. The Holy Roman Catholic Church, through the sacraments, through the teaching of the Gospels, through the church itself. But in America, especially in a nation where our founding fathers never believed in true faith and in true religion, where they themselves were very unorthodox in their belief. I don't care about the Dennis Prager arguments or the Prager University arguments, how the founding fathers were religious men. That means nothing to me. But the question to me is, were they orthodox in their faith? And of course they weren't. And through the contradictions of their own personal religious beliefs, it is only naturally devolved into what we've become today. A nation where everybody picks and chooses their own personal moral codes. And with that comes the chaos of our civilization. And really, for that matter, the breakdown of the family, which ultimately precedes all of that. I think it's not hard to figure out that the more we distance ourselves from the church and the sacraments, the more our civilization becomes disordered. But before civilization becomes disorder, the culture becomes disorder, individuals begin to break down, begin to loosen their standards of sort of moral prudence, the moral prudence that was handed on to us by our ancestors, those values, those time-tested standards that were passed on to us in order to protect ourselves from the very cultural collapse that we're living through today. We have to understand that. You know, I'll say it again. I have a unique perspective about America and American cultural life, because in many respects, I have a very old world view, because I am first generation Italian, or should I say first generation American born in this country. But my parents were both Sicilian, born and raised in Sicily. And so I have really a unique perspective from sort of the old line world. Now, I'm not the only one. Obviously, there's lots of Sicilians, but it just depends when those immigrants got here. If you're multi-generational, sort of American, you know, your parents came here in the 1880s or 1920s, and now you're into third and fourth and generation, things through sort of the pluralistic concepts of American life. I don't know how well a lot of these Italians or Irish or Germans or Polish really know their cultural roots, and for that matter, their faith and how it relates to their family. But I do. I was raised with old world parents that had old world values, and there's a complete contrast between American New World kind of liberalism and old world Catholic values that come back from the motherland or the fatherland, I believe is what it is, right? And I've had this unique experience for a long time, because in my family, both sides of my family, at least with my parents' generation, but especially more so with my grandparents' generation, we didn't have the massive disorders of our time, right? Things like divorce and remarriage, almost non-existent. Things like, disordered lifestyle, almost non-existent. Things like addiction to, whether it's pornography or gambling, pick your vice of freedom and liberty. A lot of these things didn't exist. Now, there was a fallen human nature and people struggled in a lot of ways. But even within the midst of a Catholic culture, you always had sort of this equilibrium to know how and when to get your life back in order, right? Because the church played a role, the culture played a role that was tied to the church, and governments and the church worked together oftentimes, especially in the old world. And there was a common understanding of values within that culture, right? You just simply pick and choose your own personal moral code, whatever it is you wanted to believe. You look at the disorders of our time, they are disorders of liberalism, they're disorders of modernity, they're disorders of again, our time. But there's one thing all these disorders have in common. They really pick up the intensity as we drift further and further away from the ancestral roots of our faith, the church, and the sacraments themselves. The more we drift away, the more our lives become disordered, right? And again, I've seen this first and foremost just in between sort of intergenerational kind of intermixing, right? Especially when we come to America, where it's pluralistic. Now we're not marrying other Italians, but even more so that we're not marrying other Catholics anymore, right? We're marrying Protestants, we're marrying Jews, right? Who may have different custom beliefs. So now you got to water down your beliefs, and you kind of got to half-ass it, how you raise your children. And as future generations are born and we're kind of progressing through time and space, everything is watered down. And I can tell you my generation, because my grandparents' generation was very religious, and so was our parents' religious. We all went to catechism when we were young. We all participated of the feast days and the celebrations. We walked the processions of the church. We celebrated our own individual, feast days of the saints. We went to church. There was a proper function and structure, right? We all received the sacraments. We all got married in the church with other Catholics. We all got, we all had these common bonds and common understanding of values. But as time has passed in the pluralistic culture and we fractured away from those traditional beliefs, these disorders have really come to be at this point in history. So how do we get the genie back in the bottle? Well, first we have to acknowledge what eternal truth is. And as Americans, we don't play that game, right? Your God is your God, my God is my God. As long as we don't cross each other's property lines, we don't shoot each other. Well, that's a problem. And it's really a problem of modernity, but really in large part it's an American problem. And this is why Americans have always been at war with each other. I talked about it before. There's a strange sort of dichotomy in America where one generation or a current generation is always rebelling against a previous generation. Children in America are always rebelling against their parents. And again, as a immigrant or son of an immigrant, first generation here, I've always found that quite odd, because in Italy, or at least Sicily, that really wasn't the case, right? It might have happened in a micro sense in every individual family, because no families are always perfect, right? But in general, you don't have this overriding principles or these overarching principles that you have to rebel against your parents. And this is something that is quite strange and odd. But I think, to get back to the point, the disorders of our times that have built up in time and space, combined with, again, detaching ourselves and really falling further away from the values of the faith, the church, and the sacraments. It's all playing out before our very eyes, right? You might have been here even as an immigrant. As an American, it's given, right? You turn 18 and mom and dad, I'm out the house. I got to go out and participate in the economic engine of prosperity. I got to make my own way. And before I get married, sex, drugs, rock and roll, all in college. And I'm going to somehow figure it all out and go to college and make the money and live the good life. Because in America, that's what we do. We make the money and live the good life. Yeah, but in America, we're also all disordered at this point in time. And that's an important factor that a lot of Americans don't want to deal with, right? So here's the bottom line. We've all known people, well, at least I have, okay, where the closer you are to the faith, the church, and the sacraments, the more well-ordered they are. The more they distance themselves, there's more problem within those family lineages, those family lines, right? Because then you get into the crazy moral relativism that is really American culture that allows you to pick whatever belief you want to believe. And this is the full fruition of America today. Why we can't get the genie back in the bottle. And our last gasp hope is, let's go out there and vote harder. If we vote harder, we could take back America. And stop, guys. America's being lost right now by the second. We're deteriorating as families are being destroyed. And there's no politicians out there that are going to come to the rescue of this country at this point in history. The politicians are there to fend for themselves, to sort of justify their own power base at this point in history. If you're telling me we all have to go vote in order to manage the decline, fine, I'll agree with you there to a very limited extent. But until we begin to fix this family and acknowledge eternal truth, and not this quasi half-assed Protestantized Freemasonic idea of freedom and liberty and all this Americana kind of stuff of, I get to do what I want to do. It's a problem. It's a problem. We got to get back to first principles. In the Catholic faith, in the Catholic Church, first principles are what? To love God and to love your neighbor like you love yourself. Right? It's principles that are overarching, that we're supposed to live by. Everything disseminates down from that at that point in time. And as Americans, do we put God first? No, we never have. And one of the main reasons, because we never even acknowledged God. Our founding fathers even kept the name of God out of the Constitution. That in itself sets up a cycle, a generational cycle of really bringing about the apostasy that has ensued since the Enlightenment. And it is really an apostasy of the Enlightenment that we're living through in many respects, right? I would say, I would go back even further to the Protestant Reformation, don't get me wrong, because what we have in America at its founding cores really are the wars of Protestantism in many respects, right? But we really go to a head, and we really take it to the next level, sort of in that political sphere. So we've seen the family under assault, which is what? The principles of the familial line are Catholic concepts of theology. That's how we view God as a family. Americans, we take sort of these individualistic notions, which in some respects is okay, but when it's taken to an extreme outside the bonds of the church, outside of the bonds of the familial system, you see what we create: a bunch of nihilists, a bunch of narcissists is what we create in our society. That really only fend for themselves at the end of the day. You know, it's funny because when I was in the classical liberal camp, you know, we always got these philosophical principles, how if you just get the right economic policies in place, everything is going to be work out, right? As long as, you know, we have a healthy economy, that will lead to a healthy family, right? Well, nothing has ever been actually further from the truth. And with all due respect, what we've seen is narcissism at an economic level, right? It's just taking the right, what they proclaim, not me, what they proclaim is a stolen election in 2020, to realize maybe the corporations are not our friends. And maybe these guys at the top of the food chain, these guys that, you know, that we believe thought they believed in the invisible hand and the economic engine of prosperity, maybe they weren't in it for the betterment of society. Maybe they were in it for themselves, to make a profit and to consolidate power. Because this is what we've seen from corporate America. As they bought out more and more businesses, they bought out more and more means of production. They've left the middle class out in the cold. Inflation is now kicking in. Nobody owns any property. Nobody owns any land anymore. The wealthiest are consolidating everything. And this is all done in the name of freedom and liberty, ironically enough. And the political right is stuck in a clusterfuck of ideological contradiction. And this is why the only thing the right can do at the end of the day is go back to these utopian idealistic notion: freedom, liberty, constitution, thump, thump, thump. When in fact, reality on the ground is different. Reality hasn't worked out like it was supposed to, right? This is why for the longest time, the political right defended the corporation in the name of freedom and liberty. And now the corporations have come back, and we found out that through, again, our fallen human nature, that businesses have a vested interest to protect themselves first and foremost, and to hell with the economic philosophical principles of how things in theory are supposed to work out. That disorder, that social disorder that we see at the family level, it is not only playing out in the broader culture, it is not only playing out in the political system, but it's translated over into the economic system. This is what the corporations have done. Economics is not free and clear of moral disorder. The right has always attempted to separate morality from the business sector, arguing that morality, or should I say, arguing that business in and of itself, the business transaction, right? That business itself governs itself morally, because the principles of economics in and of itself is a moral system. And now we're finding out that, guess what? If you got disorder at the family level, if you got disorder at the cultural level, if you got disorder at the political level, it's only going to translate naturally into disorder at the economic, financial, and the corporate level. Now they're figuring this out. This is the problem. And when you've had the political right, talk radio, you know, preaching this thing, oh, here come the Marxists, here come the communists, when many of the enemies of America have actually been on the right side of the aisle, now there's, you know, we got to look ourselves in the mirrors. And there's a lot of conservatives that don't want to do that. They don't want to look at themselves in the mirror. Let me give you an example. Conservative talk shows, Dennis Prager, right? He considers himself a Jewish theologian. He's kind of reassessing now, late in life. I think he's in the 60s, maybe even the 70s now. I don't know how old he is, but he's looking at the great disorder time that we live in, all the disorder at the family level, the cultural level, the global level, really at this point in time. He sees the conservative utopian vision, the philosophical principles of conservatism collapsing before his very eyes. And he came to a conclusion recently that maybe, you know, I never believed that Satan was a real entity, but now, considering what he sees, he's thinking maybe Satan is actually an entity of some sorts. Oh, really, Dennis? You've been on radio for what, 30 years, 35 years? I don't know how long it's been. And now you're coming to this realization? You've been a man, you've been a social influencer, and now you're starting to maybe get your theology straight at your late age. Let me give you a hint, Dennis, right? The church has been teaching in the existence of Satan now for 2,000 years. Catholics figured out a long time ago. And while you were pushing your classical liberal ideology on everybody, we were telling you, you're wrong. You're dead wrong. Everything you say is wrong because your classical liberal utopianism is flawed at the end. It may be mixed in with some good principles that you've taken from tradition. But see, it goes back again to what I've said about like the founding principles, right? I mean, we may find some inherently good things with what the founding fathers introduced, right? Like as Catholics, we would agree that subsidiarity, which conservatives or classical liberals call limited government, is a good thing. But that's because subsidiarity, AKA small government, limited government, is a Catholic idea. It comes from the old Catholic world, ironically enough. And what's the irony is that its subsidiarity actually worked in the Catholic world. It worked for 1,400 years. Has subsidiarity ever worked in America? I mean, if you're going to tell me it worked up until the Civil War, I guess. But I would argue it never really worked in America because in America, government has grown and grown and grown and grown since the founding. It has, if we're being honest here. See, so to come up with these conclusions now, when we've had a steady voice of reason that has taught proper morality, proper moral order for 2,000 years. And when we go back to that old world, a world that was much healthier in regards to culture, families were intact, it was vibrant cultures, right? We begin to flourish as a nation. See, listen, I'll say it again. As post-Enlightenment thinkers took over on the heels of Christendom, a Christian world that the Catholic Church built, there really wasn't much to do, was there? Because the church built all the fundamental institutions that we needed for us to become a flourishing civilization, from the educational system to the moral philosophies, right? To the technological innovations that would set up modern technological innovations, right? This is what the classical liberal Enlightenment thinkers had to take over in many respects. And they've done nothing but bastardize it now for the past 250 years. But it was the church that had to civilize a pagan, barbarian European continent. That was much harder. See, we take that for granted, what the Catholics built, what Christendom built. And what Christendom built and lasted for 1,400 years, the Enlightenment thinkers have destroyed in less than 200 years. I would argue it was already dead probably by the early 19th century as we're going into world wars, ironically enough, right? But was there a call by Christendom to overthrow the old world? No, there wasn't. There wasn't. French Revolution is a great example of that. You got a bunch of foreigners that go into France, claiming revolution, freedom, liberty, Lady Liberty, she's naked, right? Kind of a thing, right? And then you got the Catholics in France saying, we're okay with our church. We're okay with our priests and our bishops. And guess what? We're even okay with our monarch. A lot of this is just, it's got to be put into proper context. And when we minimize history, when we simplify history to simply sort of project this historical narrative to justify, to give us confirmation bias, that is the grand mistake of history. And I appeal to my classical liberal friends once again. That world was much healthier. Look where we're at today. And look at the moral depravity. See, what's funny is that we've all gotten used to this moral depravity. In fact, it's so common now that we don't even think it's a problem anymore, right? I mean, divorce and remarriage is just like, okay, $39.95, you're done, you're out, there's no commitment. You swore an oath to God. Well, maybe you swore an oath to God. You swore an oath to somebody, right? It just depends how you got married, because marriage has been made a mockery of by modern civilization, by modernity, right? But things like shacking up out of wedlock, right? Having kids out of wedlock, abortion, popping contraceptions, these things were all concepts that were condemned. They were condemned for the betterment of civilization. I would argue that as people stay closer to the church, people stay closer to sacraments, society was healthier, more vibrant. It isn't dark now where classical liberals wake up every morning, well, America's falling apart. I don't know what happened, but America is not the America I once knew. Well, if you study America, liberalism has been encroaching and devolving this nation since its founding, if we're willing to be honest here, right? Just in my lifetime alone, I've talked about it so often, how the moral principles that my parents were raised in, but especially my grandparents were in, totally polar opposite. I've watched the moral decadence, the moral debacle just unfold in my lifetime alone. I'm not sure there's ever been another generation in history that has seen such a radical change in moral principles, right? This is how fast it's happening now, right? And now we just accept what at one time were common principles of morality, things we said no to, right? Because see, isn't that the dirty little secret why the church is hated today? Because the church says no to certain behaviors, right? And nobody wants to be told no. That's where Protestantism comes in, right? Me and my personal Jesus, right? Because personal Jesus really is not in control in many respects. Personal Jesus is me establishing a covenant with God. Glenn Beck is a great example of that, right? But as we've seen, again, the world drift further and further apart from the church and from the sacraments, the more disorders have sort of come about within culture, but even more so amongst families, right? Right? So your kids grow up, they're 18. Okay, mom, dad, I'm going to go to college experience, sex, drugs, rock and roll. I'm going to move across the country because I got a job across the country, right? Mom and dad don't see me. Probably bring in the boyfriend anytime I want, you know, shacking up with a boyfriend because nobody's there to put moral judgment on, right? Because that's what families used to do. Families used to protect each other, and not just physically, but they used to protect each other in the moral realm as well too. And so here we are. We've changed all the rules. We've stripped down the faith away. We've stripped down the moral principles away. We're becoming more and more disordered, right? With disordered lifestyles and boys cutting off their penises and girls thinking that they're boys and kids out of wedlock. I mean, it's amazing to me. Children being born out of wedlock in what are Catholic families, or where at one time were strong Catholic families, our ancestors got to be rolling over in their graves. They've got to. And I'm sorry, I'm not that big of a person. I'm not that smart of a person. I'm not that arrogant of a person to say that for some reason I know better than my ancestors that sacrificed everything for me. My parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, they split blood to bring me into this world and take care of me. They safeguarded and protected those traditions. They protected the faith so that I could be as well ordered as I can, right? Not that I'm a perfect person. I would never proclaim that. But I understand, and I understand the wisdom of our ancestors. I understand the wisdom of families. And this is why nothing breaks my heart more than when I see Catholics that come from devout Catholic families, especially first generation, that decide to, well, I'm going to leave the church because, you know what, I don't like their rules. I'm in the moral canal. I get to do what I want to do. Liberty, right? Those are old fogey traditions. And yet those values that you're abandoning, they were the values of your parents. They were the moral standards of your parents, your great-grandparents, right? They were the standards of your family going back for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And now with one, with one stroke of the key on a keyboard or a cell phone, or the comforts of freedom and liberty and economic prosperity, those standards now don't apply to us anymore because we think we're better, because we think we're smarter, or because through our technological innovations or through our comforts, we can micromanage our lives better. We can overcome those mistakes, right? Right? But are we overcoming those mistakes? No. We're in the midst of a great apostasy. The faith is collapsing, and with that, the culture is collapsing. The family is utterly decimated. And in time and space, as future generations are born, and we begin, and those practices that formed us in our faith, formed us in those traditions, formed us in our culture, those begin to die off, and in even a greater chaos will ensue with the next generation and the next generation after that and the next generation after that, to the point where all of our identity is lost. Not just our moral principles, but our identity, right? Because faith is more than just following a bunch of rules. It's about who you are and how it relates back to your family, right? We got these things, these Catholics. It breaks my heart that have lost the faith within the current generation. They'll say, well, I had a great grandfather. He was a diehard Catholic. And okay, all right, you look up to him, but you look up to him most likely because he had a good moral prudence, moral standards. They were good enough for him, but they're not good enough for you. What? You got the internet now, you figured out something better for your life. And yet you look around at a lot of these people's lives, and these people's lives are completely disordered. Their kids' lives are completely disordered. And you see these disorders in a myriad of ways that they come about, right? So all I'm saying is that bottom line here is the further we drift away from the church, the further we drift away from the sacraments, the more chaos your family will be in, the more chaos individuals within your family will be in. And that translates into the destruction of the culture. And ultimately, it transcends all the way up into the political system. And we know the political system is as corrupt as can be at this point in history. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. You want to get order back into civilization, right? It's not going to happen in the ballot box. It's going to happen in your home. It's going to happen with your family. And it's going to really take brave faith to save your family from all the moral disorders around us now that are trying to take us to hell. You want to protect your family. You want to protect your children. It's not about sending them to college so they go out there and earn 6 figures, right? It's not about the economic engine of prosperity. It's not about, being the best you can be and owning the big house or having the nicest car, the material aspect of the world. It's not about that. It's about proper and just morality, moral function. The worst thing you could actually do nowadays, in my opinion, is actually send your kid to college, because that's where so many souls are being lost, right? There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. You want to protect your family, you want more order, we got to go back to what our ancestors knew, understood, and why their culture, their civilization was stronger, and why our families were intact, while now everything is falling apart, including our families. There you have it. This is Frank signing off, frankly speaking. Good night, everybody.